I was halfway through my morning coffee when I was called to my boss's office. His deep, sneering voice in the coldest baritone announced, "You're fired, Tessa. I don't deal with incompetent fools." All this because I was terribly sick and took a day off work last week. For a moment, I just stood there, gripping the styrofoam cup so hard I thought it would burst. The smell of stale coffee and the faint buzzing of the fluorescent lights made the moment feel surreal. I had worked under Mr. Kingston for years, going above and beyond on countless projects, often skipping lunch breaks and logging extra hours to meet impossible deadlines. My cheeks burned with indignation. This was so sudden, so humiliating. My body ached from the recent flu I was still recovering from, and now, on top of that, I was being kicked to the curb, as if my years of dedication meant nothing. I tried to maintain some composure. My voice quivered as I tried to defend myself, explaining that I had a doctor's note. His cold eyes merely flicked in my direction before he turned away, signaling that no further discussion was necessary. In that instant, my entire world felt like it had collapsed around me. Walking out of the office felt like stepping off a cliff into a void of uncertainty. My colleagues stood frozen at their desks, eyes wide with shock and pity. I could barely meet their gazes as I grabbed my personal belongings, a framed photo of my younger sister and me, a potted succulent that thrived under my care, and a few knickknacks that reminded me of simpler times. Security escorted me down the hallway like I was a criminal. The walk of shame felt endless, punctuated by the shuffle of my feet on the sterile floor. My heart hammered in my chest, and every step weighed heavier than the last. Reaching the elevator, I resisted the urge to shout or weep. I knew if I lost control, I might never regain it. Everything I had worked for was suddenly gone. The paycheck that kept food on my table and the routine that gave my life structure. The humiliation sank in deeper with each passing second. Once the elevator doors shut, I finally let out a shaky breath. My throat tightened and a tear escaped my eye. I forced myself to take in air, trying to figure out my next move. I drove home in a daze. Outside, the world moved as it always did. Cars honking in the congested streets, pedestrians hustling across crosswalks, while inside my car, everything felt suspended in disbelief. I clutched the steering wheel, replaying the moment in Mr. Kingston's office over and over. When I arrived at my small, rented apartment, I collapsed onto the couch, staring at the cracks in the ceiling as though they held some hidden wisdom. Bills were scattered on the coffee table. Rent, utility notices, credit card statements. My stomach twisted with anxiety. I had no immediate plan and no cushion to fall back on. All I had was the skill set I'd honed at that company. And now that was overshadowed by a humiliating termination. My phone buzzed with messages from concerned colleagues who'd witnessed the firing. A few sent supportive words, but I also saw texts from those who'd distanced themselves, likely afraid of the boss's wrath. It felt like I'd been cast off into exile. Still, under the crushing weight of betrayal, a spark of anger flickered within me. Mr. Kingston had made a terrible mistake underestimating me. Deep down, I knew I wasn't beaten yet. That night, sleep evaded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined Mr. Kingston's sneer. I felt waves of anger ripple through me, followed by doubt. What if I really was expendable? A small, insecure voice nagged at the back of my mind. But the anger trumped the insecurity. I refused to let one man's callous decision define my worth. In the early hours of the morning, I gave up on rest and decided to organize my thoughts. I sat at my kitchen table, illuminated by a single lamp, jotting down everything I had to my advantage. First, my track record. I'd led major projects that brought in hefty profits. Second, my professional network. Vendors, clients, and even some key figures in rival companies who admired my work ethic. Third, my specialized knowledge. I knew how the internal systems ran, inside and out. As I compiled this mental inventory, a sense of calm focus replaced my rage. I was good at what I did. No, I was exceptional. If Mr. Kingston chose to rid himself of someone who literally kept certain crucial operations afloat, it wouldn't be long before he felt the consequences. I resolved to make a plan. The first part of that plan involved making discreet phone calls. I started with a trusted friend, Miranda, who was now working at a growing tech firm. Over coffee the following day, I shared the condensed version of what happened. Her eyes widened in disbelief. She had once reported to Mr. Kingston too before she moved on. He's always been a tyrant, she said, gently touching my hand in sympathy. But firing you over a sick day? That's absurd. She mentioned that her company was interested in expanding. They needed someone with my project management background. However, I sensed a glimmer of caution in her tone. While she would love to recommend me, she also knew her employers might have second thoughts if they heard rumors of my termination. My relationship with Mr. Kingston had always been complicated, and he had a reputation for spinning narratives in his favor. I assured Miranda that I had no intention of jumping blindly into another job. I wanted to approach my next step methodically. Perhaps that was my anger speaking, fueling a desire to prove a point to Mr. Kingston. Nonetheless, the seed of an opportunity was planted, and I left our meeting feeling a surge of renewed optimism. Over the next week, I found myself in an odd emotional state, oscillating between frustration at my situation and exhilaration about the potential to rebuild. Though I had rent looming and no steady income, the same skill set Mr. Kingston had cast aside was in demand elsewhere. What fueled me the most was the intelligence I'd gathered from former colleagues who remained at the company. Whispers of disarray floated my way. A project I used to manage was now floundering. Important deadlines were missed, and a major client, one I had personally won over, was expressing doubts about continuing the partnership. Part of me felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. I didn't celebrate their struggle, but it was validating to see that my contributions were genuinely significant. My phone lit up with texts, half of them from stressed coworkers who missed my steady leadership. I noticed one particular pattern emerging. Mr. Kingston's arrogance had reached new heights. He was micromanaging every detail, making bad calls in areas he didn't understand. I decided that my best move was to lie low for a bit, keep gathering intel, and build my next move quietly. A storm was brewing, and I planned to position myself exactly where I needed to be. By the end of the second week, I had something resembling a plan. I reached out to key industry contacts, vendors, and long-term clients who had always praised my dedication. I didn't badmouth Mr. Kingston outright. Instead, I casually mentioned that I was between opportunities and open to collaboration. To my surprise, the responses were overwhelmingly positive. Many of them seemed eager to speak with me independently of my former company. Some even hinted that they'd prefer working directly with me rather than dealing with Mr. Kingston's unpredictable team. I tucked those comments away, feeling a bit of vindication with each conversation. Meanwhile, I networked with a few entrepreneurial folks who had once pitched ideas to our firm but were turned away. I listened to their visions. Fresh startups, inventive technology, new market expansions. An idea took shape in my mind. What if I pooled my expertise and contacts to consult on multiple projects? The freelance world was uncertain, but it offered freedom. And there was a sweet edge to the idea that I might be competing directly with the man who had fired me. If Mr. Kingston ever realized how quickly I was regaining my foothold, he might regret his hasty decision. On the third week, I put my plan into action. I filed the paperwork to register a small consultancy under my own name. Nothing fancy, just a legitimate professional identity I could present to potential clients. It felt surreal and exhilarating. Me, a business owner. I hadn't imagined this path before, but necessity had fueled my bravery. With Miranda's help, I landed my first small contract. A local manufacturing firm needed someone to streamline their supply chain system. It wasn't a multi-million-dollar deal, but it was a start. I dove into the work with the same fervor I'd once given Mr. Kingston's projects. Every successful step felt like a victory, a reminder that my talents were still valuable. The small success spread through my network. A handful of other prospects trickled in. While I juggled these leads, I kept my ear to the ground, learning about the turmoil in Mr. Kingston's office. The major client I had managed was now on the brink of terminating their contract altogether. Their dissatisfaction with the new project manager was no longer a rumor, it was a documented reality. I remembered the nights I'd sacrificed to keep that account thriving. Soon, Mr. Kingston might face the consequences of letting me go. One quiet evening, I received a call from an old friend in the finance department who was still employed under Mr. Kingston. She sounded nervous, speaking in hushed tones as if someone might be listening. "Tessa," she whispered, "the big client is about to pull the plug. They contacted us to say they're exploring other firms. She paused, her voice tight with tension. Mr. Kingston is panicking. He's called emergency meetings every day, trying to salvage the situation. I felt a twinge of satisfaction, along with a pang of empathy for my former coworkers who had to endure the fallout. In truth, the entire office was likely in chaos. That particular client accounted for a large portion of the company's revenue. Losing them would mean layoffs, cost cuts, and possibly even a round of bankruptcies if it spiraled out of control. Despite the bad blood, I couldn't fully enjoy their misfortune. I had friends there, and I knew they were innocent bystanders. Still, I reminded myself that Mr. Kingston was reaping what he had sown. My friend added that the boss had started hinting he might reach out to me for help. I nearly choked on my disbelief. He would swallow his pride before long, that much was clear. As the days rolled on, I threw myself into my new consultancy. Each new project brought fresh challenges, but also fresh victories. My client list slowly grew. Miranda's company hired me on a trial basis for a small-scale system overhaul, and within a week, I delivered results that exceeded their expectations. The positive word of mouth spread. During a quick lunch break, I scrolled through LinkedIn, noticing a flurry of posts from connections within my old firm. Many hinted at their frustration. Canceled team outings, mandatory weekend work to patch up failing projects, and abrupt budget slashes. All signs pointed to a company under immense strain. A curious email arrived in my inbox that afternoon. It was from a former client of Mr. Kingston's firm, a client I had worked with closely on a large-scale project last year. They wrote, "We've heard you're now consulting independently. We'd love to discuss a possible collaboration." My heart did a little leap. This was a major fish, a contract that could really cement my fledgling company's reputation. I stared at the email, imagining Mr. Kingston's face if he realized that the clients he once boasted about were now beating a path to my door. I scheduled a meeting with that high-profile client. The conference room they booked was sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the city skyline. My nerves crackled with anticipation. I wore my best blazer, hoping to project confidence even though my heart pounded like a drum. They were polite but direct. They wanted me to propose a comprehensive strategy to fix the recurring issues they faced. Issues that, ironically, had started after I left my old firm. We talked numbers, timelines, and deliverables. I answered each question with precise detail, leaning on my familiarity with their systems and their past challenges. Their eyes lit up at the efficiency of my suggestions. By the end of the meeting, they shook my hand, hinting that they were very close to making a decision. If I won this contract, it could be a game changer for my consultancy. As I walked out, I recalled the times Mr. Kingston had cornered me into working nights just to keep these same clients happy. Now, I was steps away from securing them for myself. I returned to my small home office that afternoon, unshaken by the shift in power dynamics. My next chapter was writing itself faster than I had ever expected. Another week passed, and I found myself juggling multiple proposals and phone calls. My momentum felt unstoppable. However, a nagging intuition told me I hadn't seen the last of Mr. Kingston's involvement in my life. The phone rang late one evening, and I almost didn't pick up. My mind was exhausted from a day of negotiations. But the caller ID was blocked, so curiosity won out. A familiar voice greeted me on the line. One of Mr. Kingston's senior managers. A person who had never particularly liked me but always respected my work. He danced around the main point, asking polite questions about how I was doing and if I'd be open to a conversation regarding some consulting opportunities. Instantly, I recognized the subtext. Mr. Kingston was feeling the heat from the failing projects, especially the big account on the brink of departure. My polite refusal was met with a strained silence. The manager tried a different angle, hinting at generous compensation if I would lend my expertise, briefly. I knew better than to show my hand. "I'm quite busy," I replied. "But we can keep in touch." I ended the call, my heart racing. The seeds of desperation were sprouting on their end. 3 days later, I woke up to find an official email from Mr. Kingston himself. The subject line, "Urgent request for assistance." My pulse quickened as I read. He outlined how my intimate knowledge of the firm's systems and workflows was uniquely valuable, and expressed a desire to discuss potential collaboration. He didn't apologize for firing me in his note. Instead, it was couched in corporate politeness, as if that day in his office had never happened. I stared at the email, recalling how his sneer made me feel worthless in that moment. Now, here he was, cloaking his desperation under formal language. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Another part of me wanted to email back a string of scathing remarks. Ultimately, I decided to let it sit, unanswered. I'd come too far to give in just yet. That same afternoon, I received a call from the high-profile client I'd recently met. They gave me the green light. The project was mine if I wanted it. My heart soared. This was the confirmation I needed, that my reputation stood on its own, independent of Mr. Kingston's firm. Vindication had never tasted so sweet. My mind spun with possibilities. Should I respond to Mr. Kingston, or continue ignoring him? He had once held my fate in his hands, and now, in a karmic twist, our roles were reversed. But I also remembered what kind of leader he was: domineering, dismissive, and dangerously prideful. I wondered if there was any possible scenario where working with him again would benefit me in the long run. Meanwhile, news traveled fast. My consultancy signing that high-profile client created a ripple effect among other potential partners. My inbox filled with inquiries, and I faced the problem of too many opportunities. It was the polar opposite of the despair I'd felt just weeks ago. Word on the street was that Mr. Kingston's firm was inching closer to losing that major client entirely. People whispered that the client had already tested the waters with other agencies, a sure sign they were ready to jump ship. If that happened, the company could face massive cuts, and Mr. Kingston's own job could be on the line. Still, I remembered the humiliation, the unfair dismissal, and the meltdown I experienced. With each success, my determination to stand my ground only intensified. One brisk morning, I decided it was time to call Mr. Kingston back, not because I was eager to help, but because I needed clarity. I dialed the number he had included in his email, half expecting his assistant to answer. Instead, I heard his voice, tense yet trying to sound cordial. He jumped into pleasantries, addressing me like a respected colleague. It felt surreal. I remembered him sneering at me, calling me incompetent just a month ago. Now he carefully chose his words, praising my problem-solving abilities and referencing the success I'd brought to his company in the past. I asked him, point blank, why fire me over a sick day if you valued my expertise so highly? A nervous chuckle escaped him, followed by a flimsy explanation about misunderstandings and policies. He never admitted wrongdoing, but I could hear his desperation. He wanted me to come back, on a consulting basis, to patch up the giant mess that had arisen in my absence. He promised me a competitive compensation package. No details yet, but enough to pique curiosity. I let him talk, offering no promises. After the call ended, I simply stared at my phone, torn between lingering resentment and the potential for strategic gain. It was almost comical how quickly the power dynamic had shifted. A month ago, I was out on the street, trembling from shock and humiliation. Now, Mr. Kingston was groveling for help, albeit in his proud, roundabout way. I had choices. I could capitalize on his desperation, negotiate a higher rate than I ever dreamed of, or I could slam the door in his face and let his empire crumble. Neither option felt entirely satisfying without some form of acknowledgement from him, an apology, at the very least. But I doubted he had that in him. In the days that followed, his emails became more frequent, each one tinged with increasing urgency. He tried different tactics: flattery, practicality, even mild guilt-tripping about how the staff missed my presence. I could practically smell his panic. I confided in Miranda, who thought I should milk this situation for all it was worth. She insisted that I draft an agreement so airtight it would protect me from any future betrayal. Deep down, I agreed. If I were to engage with Mr. Kingston again, it would only be under ironclad terms that recognized my value and offered me a safety net. He wasn't going to jerk me around twice. I spent a Saturday afternoon drafting a potential consulting agreement. It was detailed, covering my hourly rate, additional fees for after-hours work, and penalties if they attempted to terminate my contract without cause. It also included a clause about intellectual property rights for any solutions I developed. Reading through the final draft, I almost laughed at how aggressively I'd protected myself. But remembering Mr. Kingston's track record, I knew I had to be thorough. I emailed it to him with a short note. "This is the only arrangement I will consider." His response came within hours. No counteroffer on the rate, no pushback on the clauses, just a request to meet in person to finalize details. I agreed to a lunch meeting at a neutral location. The evening before our meeting, my thoughts swirled. Was I prepared to see him face to face? My resentment lingered, but so did my practical side. Perhaps there was a lesson here about turning adversity into opportunity. Maybe I could help the company and walk away with a valuable experience and a lucrative deal. Still, my heart pounded when I imagined sitting across from Mr. Kingston, remembering the day he dismissed me so casually. We met at a quiet, upscale restaurant downtown. He arrived first, dressed in a crisp suit, somehow maintaining that air of superiority even though he was the one asking for my help. I kept my posture straight, my chin high, determined not to show any hint of intimidation. He extended a hand. I shook it politely, noticing a flicker of relief in his eyes when he saw I hadn't turned around and walked out. We ordered lunch, but neither of us had much appetite. Within minutes, he brought up the contract I had sent. "This is thorough," he said, tapping the printed pages with a pen. I shrugged, unbothered. "I've taken the liberty of having our legal team review it," he continued, "and they found a few points that might need refining, but overall, we're prepared to move forward." I nodded, waiting for him to mention the elephant in the room, my sudden firing. He hesitated, then muttered something resembling an apology. It was half-baked, more an acknowledgement of circumstances than a real admission of fault. Still, it was more than I expected from a man like him. With a cool head, I reiterated my conditions. He agreed, albeit through slightly gritted teeth. I left that meeting with a signed agreement in hand, feeling an odd swirl of triumph and lingering resentment. The contract guaranteed me a rate nearly double what I had earned as a full-time employee, plus additional perks. But it wasn't just about the money, it was about the principle. The next day, I stepped into my old office building, though this time as an external consultant. Heads turned the moment I walked through the door. A hush fell across the room as staff recognized me. Some looked guilty, others visibly relieved. I knew rumors were flying. Was I back for revenge, or had I forgiven the boss who fired me? The truth was somewhere in between. Mr. Kingston organized a small introduction, announcing my role. His tone was formal, almost reverent, which contrasted sharply with the way he'd belittled me before. I picked up on the tension in the room. Many employees were eyeing me like I was a savior, while others seemed wary, afraid of Mr. Kingston's temper. Inside, I remembered all the late nights and frantic deadlines. A flicker of anger resurfaced, but I swallowed it, focusing on the task. I was here on my own terms now, and that made all the difference. Walking through the corridors, I noticed familiar faces from my team, people who once reported directly to me. They approached me with hopeful smiles, quietly confiding how chaotic things had become in my absence. Deadlines had been missed, budgets mishandled, and morale had plummeted. Some even confessed they were on the verge of quitting, having lost faith in Mr. Kingston's leadership. I reassured them that I was here to fix what I could, but only to the extent my contract allowed. I didn't want to overstep my boundaries as a consultant. My goal was to stabilize the failing project that threatened the company's largest client. The deeper I dived, the more glaring the issues became. Processes I had meticulously established were in disarray. Documents were unorganized, communications were jumbled, and staff were unsure who to report to. Mr. Kingston tried to exert control over my approach, but I stood my ground. My contract granted me autonomy and decision-making for this specific project, and I intended to exercise it. It was a surreal power shift. He'd once micromanaged every breath I took, and now he had to watch me operate with near total freedom. I couldn't deny the satisfaction that came with that reversal of fate. Over the next week, I led the team with clear directives, re-establishing the best practices I'd created before I was fired. We had daily stand-up meetings, straightforward timelines, and a newly structured communication plan. The energy among the staff gradually improved as they saw someone taking real responsibility. Mr. Kingston hovered on the sidelines, occasionally dropping into meetings to observe. He'd offer suggestions, most of which I politely batted away. At first, he scowled and glared, but he soon realized he had to let me do my job without interference. My contract, after all, was crystal clear. I called the shots on this assignment. As we reached our first major milestone, I organized a briefing for the client, a chance to demonstrate that we had rectified many of the issues plaguing the project. The client's representatives were cautiously optimistic, but by the end of the presentation they seemed visibly relieved. I could almost see them reevaluating whether they truly needed to abandon this partnership. After the meeting, one of the client's top executives pulled me aside. "This is the leadership we've been missing," she whispered. My chest swelled with pride, remembering how Mr. Kingston had once dismissed me as incompetent. The irony was delicious. It didn't take long for the rumor to spread. The major client was reconsidering leaving, mainly because of my rapid turnaround efforts. Morale soared in the office, employees felt a wave of hope. Yet, I caught Mr. Kingston pacing the halls with a restless air, clearly wrestling with his own pride. He had to witness daily how the staff gravitated toward me for guidance instead of him. The big question was whether he could stand a consultant, someone he'd fired, being hailed as the savior. I occasionally caught him glaring from his office window while I led the team through problem-solving sessions. Eventually, the client requested a formal review session with the entire executive board. It was a high-stakes meeting that could confirm whether they'd remain with the company. Mr. Kingston insisted on chairing the meeting, but the client specifically asked for my input at every critical juncture. Each time, I detailed the fixes we'd implemented, the metrics showing clear improvement, and the roadmap for continued progress. By the end, their decision was clear. They would stay, provided that I remained in a leadership capacity over the project. Mr. Kingston's forced smile looked almost painful, but he had no choice except to agree on the spot. The day after that triumphant meeting, Mr. Kingston called me into his office, his once imposing domain. I stepped inside with measured calm. He closed the door, the tension in the air almost crackling. This was the first time we were alone together since the day he fired me. He cleared his throat and offered a stilted, "Congratulations." I could sense he was swallowing a bitter pill. In many ways, I had just saved his company from a catastrophic loss. But my methods also highlighted how his leadership had been lacking. He mentioned extending my contract for additional projects, carefully skirting around the fact that he'd fired me for a ridiculous reason. It took all my restraint not to remind him, again, how he disregarded my worth. I simply listened, then politely said I'd consider it, provided the terms remained favorable. There was an uneasy pause. Perhaps he wanted to offer something resembling an apology, or show some gratitude. Instead, all he managed was, "I appreciate your efforts." I accepted the compliment with a nod, not wanting to push for more. Deep in my heart, I recognized that his grudging respect was probably the closest he could come to admitting how wrong he'd been. I walked out of his office feeling a swirl of emotions. Part of me wanted an outright apology, complete with him admitting the injustice of firing me over a legitimate sick day. Another part of me realized that I didn't need his validation anymore. His actions had already proven how crucial my skill set was. I checked my phone and found a new message from one of the startup clients I'd been courting. They were ready to sign a long-term consulting contract. Another victory, independent of Mr. Kingston's firm. Suddenly, I saw how my future could branch out in multiple directions, none of them dependent on the job I once had. Yes, I had made a strategic choice to come back and help this company avoid ruin, but in doing so, I'd also demonstrated my own resilience. I had proven, to myself more than anyone else, that I was strong enough to bounce back from betrayal and carve out my own path. Walking past the rows of cubicles, I noticed the looks of admiration from staff. I returned a few nods and smiles, heading for the exit. A comforting realization bubbled up inside me. I had grown beyond what this place could ever offer. Outside the office building, I paused, taking a deep breath of the crisp afternoon air. 1 month ago, I'd left through these doors feeling worthless and broken. Now I stood here empowered and triumphant, having turned the tables in a way I never thought possible. If there was any lesson to learn from this experience, it was that self-worth doesn't come from a job title or an arrogant boss's approval. It comes from the skill, dedication, and belief you carry within yourself. Mr. Kingston failed to realize that real loyalty and respect are earned through mutual trust, not through intimidation or rash decisions. I headed to my car, my phone buzzing with new messages, potential clients, supportive friends, and perhaps more overtures from Mr. Kingston's team. There was no bitterness left in my step, only quiet satisfaction and a sense of infinite possibility. I thought back to that day when he fired me for being sick. How trivial and short-sighted it all seemed now. His company was still standing, thanks largely to the work I'd done as a consultant. But I no longer needed them in the same way they needed me. With a determined smile, I drove away, ready to shape a future where no one could ever belittle my value again.